The Neo Geo, the Don, the Capo, the Big Kahuna, the final boss of the 16-bit console generation. A reputation for 2D gaming shock and awe that its rivals could just never match. But just what was the source of this power, and was it really all that? I'm going to try and find out whilst I take a look at some of the games that push this system to its limits. And let's start at the very beginning and take a look at some of the launch titles just to give us a bit of a baseline. This is NAM 1975, possibly the first game created for the Neo Geo, and it was, at least briefly, offered as a packing game with the console. And don't get me wrong, this is far from terrible, but if you'd laid out the asking price of $600 for console and game, well, you might start to think that spending a third of that much on a Mega Drive with a copy of Sonic was a much better deal. You might also think the same about Cyberlip, a budget brand Contra that didn't have a budget price. Again, not really awful, but the home port of Strider would give you a better time for quite a bit less than the $200 that this game would cost you at launch. But this system undoubtedly had tremendous potential that was still untapped. Yes, the Neo Geo was the arcade system you could play at home, and that wasn't just marketing battle gab, but the literal truth. The exact same machine on the inside with the exact same games that you fed coins into at the arcade you could have at home if you had the money. The console-style AES for the living room and the cabinet-based MVS for the coin-operated arcades. This was not the norm, and the Neo Geo had a pretty unusual architecture too that in some ways was totally typical of its arcade origin, but in others, well, it did its own thing. And yes, early titles are often pretty spotty on any system, and it doesn't take much looking to find some games from this era that do show a lot more promise, like Blues Journey here. A colourful game with a lot of parallax effects, something that the Neo Geo was well suited to. Yes, this system has a fast processor by the standards of the time and a huge colour palette, but it also takes a unique approach to drawing its graphics. Most game systems from this period, arcade or home console, have graphics based on two elements: backgrounds and sprites. Parodius on the TurboGrafx 16 providing an excellent example of the typical setup, the sprites being objects that move independently of the background, player characters, enemies, all that stuff. Different systems might have different capabilities, more background layers, more sprites, but too many games machines to mention work on this same basic principle. The Neo Geo is a bit different though, because it's all sprites, the whole screen, near enough, built out of these movable objects. 381 in total can be on screen at once, and they can be quite large too. 16 pixels wide but up to 512 pixels high, meaning that you can cover the whole screen with just 20 of them. A fact that I can demonstrate here in Magician Lord by using some emulator magic to disable some sprites, and we can see how the three separate layers of those sprites on top of each other make up the background in this section. And the Neo Geo has some built-in features that make it easier to join up lots of sprites into one big whole like this. This gives the Neo Geo the multiple background layers that lots of 16-bit machines had, but with greater flexibility. If you want multiple background layers to make parallax depth effects, you can do that. If not though, you can save the resources to do something else like great big honking character graphics. Something that I will get onto in just a moment. And before I go any further, here is a word from this video's sponsor, Magic Spoon. Yeah, this is cereal, but reinvented. Cereal for grown-ups maybe. Magic Spoon has only 4 to 5 net grams of carbs per bowl, but 13 to 14 grams of protein. Great if you're ketoing or whatever. There's 4 flavours in the variety pack, and I do like them all, even the peanut butter, which I didn't think I would do, but my favourite has to be the frosted here, and on taste alone, this is an absolute winner, but also texture too. It is satisfyingly crunchy, and I could, I think, eat this entire box in one go, but that's probably not recommended. So start your new year off right with Magic Spoon. Click the link below to grab a variety pack of Magic Spoon cereal and try it today. Be sure to use the promo code Chiropolis at checkout to get $5 off any order, or go to magicspoon.com/Chiropolis. And Magic Spoon is so confident in their product, it's backed with a 100% happiness guarantee. So if you don't like it for any reason, they'll refund your money, no questions asked. So click the link below and use code Chiropolis for $5 off, or go to magicspoon.com/Chiropolis to save $5 today. Okay, back to the Neo Geo, and let's have a look at Super Spy. Not the most famous game in the catalogue, let's say that, but one of a few very early Neo Geo games that really did push the limits by doing something different. You might call this a first-person beat-em-up, or maybe even call it a first-person shooter, but that is pushing it a bit. It does show off the Neo Geo's ability to push massive amounts of pixels, though. Yes, those enemies are absolutely enormous. There's also a good bit of another Neo Geo speciality, sprite scaling. That is, it can make sprites zoom in or out, something really common on arcade machines of the day, but still pretty much unheard of on home consoles back then. In reality, on the Neo Geo, sprites can only be zoomed out, not in. The sprite has to be stored in memory as big as it's ever going to be, then it can be shrunk or brought back to its original size. Still, it's good enough for many purposes, and there's no limit to the size of the objects it works on, allowing it to be used on the walls of this game, giving the impression of movement. Another two Neo Geo games attempted the same thing as Super Spy, that is Cross Swords and its CD-only sequel, Cross Swords 2. I'm not going to be talking about the CD system in this video, but these two might be better games than Super Spy, but that does deserve the credit as the originator. Let's take a look at another game, in fact yet another launch title for the home system, and a totally unique entry in the Neo Geo library, Riding Hero. Yes, it's the only racing game of this type on the system, the only one that attempted this pseudo 3D look. Other platforms were absolutely thick with this sort of game: Outrun, Rad Racer, Test Drive, too many to mention, but not on the Neo Geo. This though pays obvious homage to Sega's Hang On, but frankly doesn't look even as good as the 1985 original, let alone the 1987 sequel, Super Hang On. It does though have some unique features like the RPG elements in the single player mode, and also a two-player mode via a local area network port built into the cartridge. Yes, you can connect two Neo Geos this way, both the home version and the arcade. The first game on this system to do that, but not the last. It also supported memory cards too, another Neo Geo innovation for saving, alongside many other later games as well. In visuals, this might be a bit lacking. The scaling sprites used for the scenery and other vehicles do look pretty good, but they are quite sparse and the track is oddly narrow. The way it's drawn is, I think, very similar to how it's done in this type of game on other systems, but instead of a background layer for the track, it's a load of sprites chained together. This is made to curve by scrolling individual lines left and right as the image is being drawn, but because of the way the Neo Geo handles its graphics, it's probably difficult to make it wide. Plus, with so many sprites tied up in drawing the track and background scenery, there's not that much left for extras like roadside objects. This may well actually be something that really does push up against the limits of the Neo Geo, a literal limit pusher, as it was not really made for games like this, certainly not in the way that Sega's dedicated arcade machines were in games like Outrun and Power Drift. Yes, this does still look way better than games on many home systems of the time, but it's definitely not going to compete with Sega's GP Rider that was released the same year. Maybe someone could have come up with something better than this, but no one ever did. Arcade game developers must have taken note and stayed away from the Neo Geo when making this type of game in the future. Yeah, definitely a sort of failed experiment, but now onto the type of game you were probably actually expecting when you clicked on this video. Let's have a look at Metal Slug. Yes, we're jumping quite a way ahead in Neo Geo history. This was launched in April 1996, and at this point all the other 16-bit systems were looking distinctly withered. This was undoubtedly the 32-bit era. The Sega Saturn and especially the Sony PlayStation had made 3D games the dominant force, and with Nintendo on the cusp of releasing the N64 and Mario 64, it was going to take a miracle for an old-school sprite-based 2D game to make an impact, but Metal Slug managed it. With an absolutely beautifully drawn and fluidly animated cartoon style that takes a lighter look at the horrors of war, stuffed with black humour and veering gleefully into bad taste very often. There was nothing like it at the time, and even all these years later it's hard to top this for 2D action. Cuphead is about the only game I can think of that really goes further than this, and even then it's in a totally different style. Compared to Cyber Lip, yes, there's a reason I made you look at that. Compared to Cyber Lip, this is in another league, and even the better run and gun games of this period pale into comparison with the wonderful aesthetics of this game. It's not just the talented artists of the developer Nazca though here, but the talents of the Neo Geo hardware, particularly its prodigious amounts of graphics storage available. The ROM file for Metal Slug is over 24 megabytes, with 16 megabytes of that devoted solely to graphics, several times more than even the largest cartridges on other consoles. This is a big part of why Neo Geo games look so good, purely storage space, but there is more to it than that. With most classic consoles, you have to deal with video memory or video RAM. If you want to display anything on the screen, you need to copy graphics data into the video memory in the right way so that the graphics chip can turn it into a TV picture. And much of that comes in the form of tiles like this, 8x8 blocks of pixels. But storage space is limited, so you can only fit so many tiles in there at once, maybe a couple of thousand, on a system like the Super NES. This limits the amount of graphics data you can use at any given time, and in fact, loading in all the required data is a big bottleneck for many 16-bit games. But this is where the Neo Geo shines, like many arcade machines, and in fact a bit like the NES too, though that's another story. The Neo Geo has most of its graphics data stored in separate ROM chips on these enormous cartridges, and these are mapped directly into the video chip's address space, meaning no loading time at all, no waiting for access, no swapping stuff in and out, insane amounts of graphics data on tap instantly. Metal Slug has 16 megabytes available and over 135,000 larger 16x16 graphics tiles available with zero loading needed. And later games in the same series went even further than that, like Metal Slug 3, with even larger banks of graphics memory on offer, along with other Neo Geo titles too later on. That's why Metal Slug games can look so good. There's very little repetition. The backgrounds look like hand-drawn scenes, and that's because they are. Everything has got so many frames of animation possible because there's so much space to store all this stuff, and yet it can still be called up instantly. Couple that with the massive amount of pixels that this machine can put on the screen, the number of objects it can handle, and well, you've got an amazing looking game. The Neo Geo does have video RAM, but all it stores is the layout data, what things are on the screen and where, and that is relatively quick to update. But despite this, Metal Slug still only runs at 30 frames per second, probably to keep frame pacing more even when things get busy. The same thing applies to Metal Slug 3 too, but this huge graphics capability is the Neo Geo's superpower, something no other home console could match in this era. Even the mighty PlayStation struggled to recreate Metal Slug accurately. Its port is a bit lacking, notably in frames of animation. In fact, all the PS1 ports of Neo Geo games are a bit downgraded. Why? Well, despite the fact that CDs can easily store hundreds of megabytes, way more than even the biggest Neo Geo cartridge, it's limited by RAM. The system has nowhere near enough to fit the whole game in at once, and the CD-ROM drive is just too slow to keep up. The only way to make it work is to cut things out and reduce the amount of memory needed. And of course adding lots of extra loading from disk, as well as in the case of Metal Slug, lower quality sound, though not all the Neo Geo ports suffer this so much. But now I think we need to get onto that major pillar of SNK's success. Yes, I think it's time to talk fighting games. And if you hadn't heard, the Neo Geo did have a few good ones. In fact, so many that it's a serious problem to pick out the best. From the first Fatal Fury in 1991, one of the originators of the modern fighting game, all the way to Samurai Showdown 5 Special, the last official Neo Geo release, bookending the golden age of fighting games. Choosing just a couple of these games as the best out of a huge pile of brilliance might seem a bit arbitrary, but there's two that I really want to focus on especially, and first up it's Galaxy Fight. This might come as a bit of a surprise because frankly no one thinks this is the best fighting game on the system. In fact, it might well be in the running for the worst, but that's on the gameplay front. Technically, I would argue that this is perhaps the most impressive. It does a lot of things that no other Neo Geo game does. First of all, take note of the realistic shadows. Yes, some of the King of Fighters series games do that trick as well, but there's more that this game does with them. On this stage, the home of one of the many boring characters whose name escapes me, the shadows appear and disappear with the flashes of lightning, a nice atmospheric touch. But we also have the characters' feet disappear into the mud with some appropriate splatter animation too. And that mud itself has quite a nice animated effect going on. Actually, the line scrolling that made Riding Hero possible put to a different use. And on Masafar's stage, the robot thing, we have not just shadows but very nice reflections in the puddles. Of course, the Neo Geo has nothing like real-time lighting effects. This is just the main sprites upside down on a layer below the floor graphics, but it does look superb. But the real peach of this has to be Gunter's stage, this wonderful looking ankle-deep lake with characters reflected in the rippling water. You've probably noticed though that these effects are all a bit flickery. That's because the Neo Geo lacks any of the transparency or translucency effects that other systems have. Unlike the Super NES, which can do this stuff really well, like these clouds in Super Aleste, the Neo Geo can only do this by faking it. It just flickers the graphics on and off every other frame, which sort of looks okay on an old school CRT, but with modern monitors it just looks flickery. One of quite a few blind spots in the Neo Geo's capabilities, but I will come back to that. This game also piles on the parallax effects where multiple layers of graphics give a depth effect. It's visible on every stage but really dense here and here, with maybe up to 10 overlapping layers in the form of these pillars and other objects. And there's also loads of other scaling effects going on too, standard issue on Neo Geo Fighters, but here turned up to the max, including some quite realistic looking foreshortening on the playfield when a character jumps. Shame this game is just not that good. The characters aren't particularly exciting, it doesn't play that well, it's not a classic, and I doubt I'll get many arguments about that from fighting game fans. It's also really difficult. I mean, I'm no fighting game expert, but I can usually get pretty deep into a single player campaign without too much effort, but this time I just can't seem to get anywhere, and that's why I'm using such obvious cheats to capture this footage. So let's move on to something that absolutely is an undisputed classic. It's Garou, Mark of the Wolves.
They existed. Those blinded by ambition. Those consumed.
For many, the favourite Neo Geo fighter bar none, and if it isn't yours, well, it's got to be up there. Yes, this has it all, the animations, the backgrounds, it's overflowing with wonderful design and beautiful little flourishes. It doesn't go in for the technical trickery that Galaxy Fight does, but it doesn't really need to. It's all about that fabulous pixel art. One of the larger games on the system, it's got 64 megabytes of pure graphics data on tap. No wonder it's got so many details and so many frames of animation. The Neo Geo was 9 years old when this came out, and even the PlayStation was looking long in the tooth at this point, but you'd still struggle to find a home system that could handle this game. And it wasn't until the Dreamcast port in 2001 that you could enjoy this on anything but the Neo Geo. It held its own in the arcade too, going up against machines with way more power, not just newfangled 3D fighters, but still plenty of 2D games. Whilst in the living room, the Neo Geo was still very much the connoisseur's choice for hardcore gamers with deep pockets. For arcade operators, the people with rooms full of cabinets, the Neo Geo was probably the budget option. And that was kind of the point of this system from the very start. The arcade versions of these games came on cartridges just like the home games did, albeit in a different format. Not the first system to attempt this and not the last, but by far the most successful, and was supposed to be a cheaper way of doing things, designed to appeal to arcade owners' bottom lines, especially in emerging markets. I can't find any solid info on prices, but I'm sure a Garou cartridge for your existing Neo Geo arcade cabinet was cheaper for arcade owners than investing in a Capcom CPS-3 system board that played Street Fighter III Third Strike, that other legendary 2D fighter from the same year. You might have your own opinion about which is the better game, but Street Fighter III used much more advanced gaming hardware than the Neo Geo, and the fact that they are even comparable is a testament to the talented developers at SNK and the 2D gaming titan that is the Neo Geo. A system that was 2 generations behind in 1999 and yet still very relevant. So what else can I say about the Neo Geo? Only 157 officially licensed games, but very few stinkers. Let's have a look at some more titles in brief. Almost random picks really, I'm sure you'll have your own favourites that I don't mention. Viewpoint, a really nice looking shooter that came out in 1992, one of the first games that really showed what the console could do. Yes, it seems to be inspired by Sega's Zaxxon, but it looks amazing with all those pre-rendered animated 3D enemies. It's also got a fabulous soundtrack that made use of the Neo Geo's massive capacity for sampled sound. In fact, the Neo Geo had quite a few great shooters, even if it never hit the heights it did with the fighters. Blazing stars showing what's possible, and again, this really does look very good, something that even 32-bit machines would struggle to match. The backgrounds here are really spectacular, especially the 3D looking ones, really just short animated loops tiled on the screen, but very effective. Neo Drift Out is another high point, one of several overhead races on this system, and one that makes excellent use of the scaling capabilities to zoom the track in and out. I'm surprised that developers didn't come up with more inventive uses for this scaling, but this is a nice one besides the dramatic framing of fighting games. And yes, sports games were quite a big thing on the Neo Geo too, but there's one that really stands out to me as the absolute best of the bunch. Yes, Neo Turf Masters, how could I leave this out, from the same people who created Metal Slug, and yes, I always play as Kurt Russell. In fact, they all look a bit like Kurt Russell in different disguises. Maybe that's explained in the game's backstory, maybe not. But even this is a bit of a rarity with its attempts to draw a sort of 3D world and its marshalling of more raster effects to do it. But it's hard to ignore the fact that Neo Geo games really do tend to play safe. No one ever went that far out of the box. But I suppose by the time the system really got going, there were many more options out there for developers, and if you wanted to do anything different, you just wouldn't pick the Neo Geo. Even the works of NG Dev Team, a modern developer who've made a few Neo Geo games, doesn't mess with the formula all that much. And the Neo Geo has more restrictions than its mighty reputation sometimes allows for. There's lots of things it just plain can't do, and it's not just the confines of the arcade environment that prevented it. Its greatest strength is also its biggest weakness. The way graphics are stored in the ROM does absolutely have its downsides. Any sort of software rendering is basically impossible. For that you need lots of graphics RAM, something this system just doesn't have. You can't create new graphics on the fly without it, which means proper 3D is off the menu, and even a game like Lemmings might be impossible. And no one ever added extra RAM to the cartridges like some NES games did. Probably not totally, completely impossible, but would have been quite difficult for various technical reasons. Yes, the Neo Geo is a bit of a strange one. The Super NES can outpace it in certain areas, yet even the PlayStation can't keep up at times. And it wasn't until the next generation after that, with the Dreamcast and the PlayStation 2, that we can confidently say that home machines could do everything the Neo Geo could, at least in 2D. What about the Neo Geo CD? Not carts, but discs. And what about the Saturn, that other 2D beast? Well, let's leave all that for another day. One more thing before I go though, this is the Neo Geo 3D demo by Oxygen. Aren't 3D graphics supposed to be impossible on this system? And no, this is not running on the Neo Geo CD, which does have quite a lot of extra RAM. That is not necessary, this will run from a cartridge. How is this done? Well, taking a look into the ROM file with the graphics viewing tool, it seems to be just a looped animation of a 3D cube, a sprite that's moved around on the screen and scaled like the 3D rendered sprites you can see in quite a few Neo Geo games. So it is sort of faking it, but still it does look really good. So this has got to be the end now. Thank you as always to my wonderful Patreons. Thank you and thrice thank you. If you would like to join them, it really does help me. There is a link below. If you haven't already, then maybe subscribe as well, and I will say goodbye and thank you for watching. Actually, before I go, just two more things. Number one, there's absolutely no way that I've pronounced Garou in a way that will satisfy the pronunciation police in the comments. Well, please do leave me a comment saying that I've got it wrong, because any sort of interaction does help a video. And also, sort of irrelevant to this, but did you know that Neo Geo is also an art movement? Does it have a link to the console at all? I don't know, maybe you could tell me. Also, it's the name of an album by a guy from Yellow Magic Orchestra, whose name I definitely can't say, which features a collaboration with Iggy Pop. That's a pretty weird combination, but anyway, now it really is time to go. Thank you very much for watching. I really will see you later.